Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Wherever you are, I'm Leah Markey, the Director of the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago. I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's installment of Race and Dialogue, a conversation series from our center that features cross-generational discussions between scholars of pre-modern critical race studies and/or critical Indigenous studies. We're honored to have two brilliant art historians with us today, Gallant and Kaplan, who together cover medieval and early Renaissance European art, North and South. We're looking forward to hearing Denva's and Paul's perspectives on the topic of the Black presence in European art from 1100 to 1500, and to hear them discuss a bit about the historiography of the field and about new research and development. I can't resist noting that when we paired them together, we didn't know that they were already discussing their research with one another and having conversations about the state of the field. So we're grateful that they're making a conversation public for all of us today. We're putting their websites into the chat now, and we'll also provide information about their publications as the conversation continues, just to say that we will not be doing formal introductions for them. And before they begin their conversation, I will read the Newberry's land acknowledgement. As part of our commitment to addressing the ongoing legacies of dispossession and settler colonialism, as well as our relationships with the city, the land, and the environment, the Newberry Library has crafted this acknowledgement in partnership with the Chicago American Indian Center. Located near the confluence of several waterways, the Newberry Library sits on land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations, the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations, and the Maiamia, Wea, Takiwaki, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous people continue to live in this area and to celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways. Today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. As a Chicago institution, it is the Newberry's responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose land we are situated. And since this is a virtual event, you all, our panelists and audience members, are joining us from many different places. Wherever you currently are, we encourage you to learn how you may be of service to the people on whose lands you are situated, and to seek to understand your place within the history that has brought us to reside here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Denva and Paul. Thank you for being here. We'll start taking questions from the audience around 30 to 40 minutes into the conversation. Feel free to put questions into the Q&A at any point in the discussion.
Well, thank you so much for inviting the two of us. And as you said, we've already been in conversation with one another. So this is, I don't know, part 4 or something for us. Denva, you want to say any initial comments?
No, we've been in conversation and Paul has been really generous with his time when I first reached out to him. But I think we'll get to that since I have this slide up, Paul.
Okay.
I would like for us to talk about how we got into this.
Well, I was going to ask you first, but all right, I'll do it, but I'll try to be quick. So my route to doing this kind of work, and on the screen you see some things that I've written or contributed to, essentially comes out of a family enterprise pioneered by my father, who in the post-World War II period went back to school, got a degree in history, ended up teaching English at the University of Massachusetts, but was an early Black Studies scholar. His name was Sidney Kaplan. And when I was a teenager, he nudged over into an American art history. His interest had always been in race, first African Americans in American history, then in literature, and finally in art history. And in the mid-60s and then in the early 70s, he was involved with 2 of the very early shows about the representation of people of color in American art of the 18th and 19th centuries. One was at Bowdoin College. The other one was at the National Portrait Gallery, called The Black Presence in the Era of the American Revolution. So I became sort of a research assistant to him. He had two Fulbrights in Europe in the 60s, and I became absolutely fascinated with the earlier history of European representation of Blackness when I was kind of still in my late teens. And by the time I went to college, I was plunged into the middle of it. I ended up focusing in particular on the story of the three magi. And on one side of the slide there, you can see a book of mine from 1985, which came out of my doctoral dissertation. All of this, of course, much influenced also by the political climate of the 1960s and the sort of central issue of civil rights, which encouraged me, even in looking at these remote periods, to continually be thinking about its application and the eventual influence on the kind of issues of representation and more broadly social issues that continue to afflict us. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. Denva, tell us about your route to this kind of work.
Paul, I had no idea. So this was so enlightening to me too. I was nodding and listening earnestly because I was like, I didn't know this, Paul. I have to look up your father's work after this.
Yeah.
So I'm quite new to this field. I would say probably like yourself, Paul, at a moment, a political moment, perhaps. It was just the pandemic and Black Lives Matter. And so I saw the field change. People were presenting on things like I'm showing you right here, which is Giotto's Mocking of Christ. It's in the Arena Chapel, 1305. And so I heard some papers and I thought, I can do more with this and I want to do more with this. And I think one thing I'd love to share at this point is it can be difficult when you represent the thing that you are studying, right? And so I thought about this really long and hard because of that, being identified with that and perhaps thinking that I had another agenda in mind to impose, and hopefully we'll get into these categories of race, which is quite new to our field of art history. Perhaps not for English or any art history, but art history, we're really kind of just tiptoeing or getting our feet wet in it. So I thought I had something to add, and I was really fascinated with the rhetorical use of Blackness in these images. And I started really with reading, of course, your work and looking at the image of the Black in Western art.
Say before you go further, say a word about your previous work as a medievalist,
Yeah.
for which this represents a kind of outgrowth from, I think.
Yeah, so my first book is on a 14th century Neapolitan manuscript of the Vitae Patrum, the Lives of the Desert Fathers. And although I work on a Morgan Library text, there a part of my dissertation, I did look at one at the Vatican that is Sicilian. And I was always shocked because there's a representation of a desert father called Abba Moses, and he's called an Ethiopian in the text. But in the book or in the manuscript that my book is on, he's white, or he's the color of the parchment. All the desert fathers are as such. And so in the Vatican manuscript, he has brown skin and he has a turban. And so that was my first kind of inkling. Oh, Sicily might be different. Maybe I should think about Sicily, but it was such an outlier for the book project that I didn't pursue it in any real form. Yeah. Um, I know we wanted to talk about the impact of this book that I have with.
Maybe we can go back one slide, Denva, or
Yeah.
Dylan, whoever's controlling this, to the the image of the Black cover in the lower corner there. Uh, the, the image of the Black in Western Art Research Project has been something that has at first kind of paralleled my interest and then intersected with it. I suspect that most of you who are in the webinar are familiar with this series, but if you want some idea of their vastness, look right over my head on my study bookcase where a bunch of them, not quite all of the volumes, are piled up as if they're going to collapse on me imminently. This was a project that was begun conceptually in the 1960s, really, and spearheaded by Dominique de Menil, a major philanthropist in the arts based in Houston and Paris. The Menil Foundation began to publish volumes out of an enormous photo archive that they assembled. Most of that photo archive today and for the last 15 years or so available on ArtStore, by the way. As I was an undergraduate writing a thesis and then a graduate student writing a dissertation, I was sort of looking over my shoulder at what was going to come out of this project. But initially, it was it was a closed research project. There were people who were hired to write volumes on various periods in the history of art, but their facilities were not open to a general public. But for example, in the late 70s, two French scholars in particular produced two volumes. You see one of these on your screen on medieval art, on the image of the Black in medieval art specifically. Two very learned and extremely useful volumes. In my own case, after a sort of an abortive attempt to get more connected to the project in the 80s, I was drawn back into it in 2006 or 2007 when the project had been transferred to what's now the Hutchins Institute at Harvard University, directed by Henry Louis Gates Jr. The British art historian David Beinman became general editor, and at that point, I was asked to contribute to the medieval volumes, a new introduction, and a big essay on Italian art for one of the new volumes that were published in 2010, 2011. So the books themselves, but also the photo archive, are a kind of inescapable resource, intimidating in some ways. But the great virtue of the project is that rather than trying to foreclose further discussion, its volumes, to me, have always opened up the possibility of greater discussion, making data more available. And I don't know how many of you on the call have used the photo archive, or indeed one of the actual the actual hard copy photos, either at Harvard or the Warburg Institute in London. But it's an amazing experience to use these resources as you try to think through some of the issues. The last thing I'll say about it, and then I'd love to hear Denva's take on it all, is that it's not exhaustive by any measure, nor has it ever pretended to be. There's something over 26,000 photos in the archive, but there are many thousands of further images, many of which I'm sure have not yet been uncovered for scholarly discussion. How did it affect you when you started your work, knowing that these resources were out there?
I think it's a good basis for jumping off. As you say in your introduction, the two French scholars who wrote the first volume were really north of the Alps. So a lot of the imagery that you see is north of the Alps, and not south of the Alps. And I'm an Italianist, so I wanted to know a little bit more about that, and you provided some of that. I think we continually need to ask ourselves, and again, this is not something that the image of the Black ever purported to be, but thinking about the Western European gaze within that work and maybe questioning it, challenging it. I think scholarship is moving forward with that, but languages, you just need more and so that it can be a little bit robust. I do think that for me, it was the beginning of seeing the categories that scholarship has often used to describe Black Africans, right? Moor, Ethiopian, um, sometimes I think there's a section of this demonic, you know?
Yes.
So I was slowly becoming, I won't say habitualized, that would not be good, but just familiar with those terms. And so it was my first foray into the topic, and it provides, if there are any graduate students out there, or scholars who are thinking about doing this work, it is a great beginning. And I do think there's more work to be done on it, especially because I'm here in Houston at Rice, and the Manils were so important in Rice getting the art history department here, and also the Manil Foundation over there, not too far away from us.
Right.
So I think it's a good beginning. I
Right.
do think there's ways we can be much more expansive, but
Right. Well,
yeah,
I think
60s.
one of the limitations of the series as it initially developed under the Manil Foundation and Dominique de Manil is her original motivation was a kind of gut feeling. She was very troubled coming from France to Texas in the 1950s about the prevalence of racism. And she turned a little bit to the canon of Western art with the hopes of finding the way in which what she would have defined as great art could sort of undercut racist prejudice, right?
Mm,
That was sort of a quite clearly articulated founding statement. I think we have evolved since then, understanding that even powerful art can often powerfully reinforce racial prejudice.
mm.
That the axiom that the better the image we found of people of color in the Western tradition, the more it would disable racist ideology. I think we know that that's not necessarily true. Um, my feeling is that uncovering the objects is critical, right? Because we can't have a viable conversation without the ability to know what's there in, the archive, right? But it doesn't mean that of its own accord somehow it will address those powerful contemporary issues that we're all, to one degree or another, I think, concerned with in doing this kind of work.
Yeah, I agree. I want to turn us to some images because um, when I first approached Paul, I was really interested in his take on the Hohenstaufen. So thinking about Frederick II and Sicily. And I think we could probably move there and look
Oh,
at two objects.
I love your personal photos here. That's great. I know you took these.
Yeah. Um, any thoughts on John or who we think might be John? I mean, we probably should. You can perhaps tell people a little bit about this history.
Oh, I'll say just a word, but you should go on with it because you've been more immersed in it lately. Just one thing I'll say about the bust, or the head rather. Um, uh, this is a work, from the first half of the 13th century. It's in the museum in Lucera, where Frederick II of Hohenstaufen settled a substantial number of Sicilian Muslims after kind of wiping out resistance to his rule in Sicily, made them kind of personal servants, but allowed them a certain degree of autonomy. And I've speculated, as have a few other scholars, that this might be actually a portrait of the of Frederick's Chamberlain, known as Johannes Maurus, John the Moor. Um, but the thing that has always struck me about it is the use of gray stone for the head, which must be quite deliberate. It wasn't a common choice, as far as I know, in the Hohenstaufen era for sculpture. But do you want to talk for a moment about the experience? I haven't seen this work for a couple of decades now. I'd love to hear you talk about your reaction to it viscerally when you got to Lucera.
I mean, it was wild. So I always tell my students, seeing things in situ is just revolutionary. And what I mean by in situ, I just mean in person.
Right.
Um, I thought this head, just because of the presence of it when it's photographed, was much bigger, but it's practically a little bit bigger than the size of my palm,
Hmm.
right?
Yep, smaller than mine.
So yeah, it's really astonishing that photography gives it so much presence. I mean, even my photography here gives it. So my encounter was really important. I should have this picture of it because there's a white marble head right beside it with gray striations on it.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah, so there, I don't
Wow.
know if it's conscious. I was the only person in that museum, by the
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
Um, to put, and he has kind of what I would say Caesar locks, so like strands of hair. It's definitely not trying to provide any phenotypical representation of a Black African, right? So
Hmm.
putting these two in juxtaposition is really, really nice and would be really nice to bring students. I wonder because it is absolutely flat on the other side, it's not carved in the round. Where was this? I mean, I think that's a question that if one were to study this, and I know that Jacqueline Lombard has looked at this too. Um, w- that is a question about thinking where this would have been and how that might affect our reading of it.
Seems like it had to have been part of some either piece of elaborate furniture or in an architectural setting. But
Yeah.
again, the flat, I think there's, I don't know of other Hohenstaufen objects that have that particular feature. But there has been some interesting speculation. There's been some recent work coming back to this. I think it's Joanne Norman, is that who I'm thinking of? Who has written about southern, maybe the Bari throne, another object that's a little bit earlier, but that also has the potential for images of Africans. There are some scholars who are beginning to try to contextualize this in a larger sense, but there's a lot left to be done. Um,
Absolutely.
tell us a little bit about the manuscript on the other screen, Denva.
Yeah, just to say one more thing about
Yeah.
the head to the left.
Oh, sure.
I took a close look at the scar. So Johannes was sometimes referred to as deformatus, so deformed.
Yes.
And so many people think this is him because of that. And so when I looked at this object, and I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see it? Probably not. No.
Barely. Yeah. Yeah. It's there. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you can see the line through his face. And I wanted to know if that was intentional, right? Or if it was some kind of mistake. And it does feel intentional, the way that it starts from the upper cheek and goes through the lips and hits here feels really intentional to me. And so I wondered a little about this. I mean, another question is to put this maybe in conversation with other portal or sculpture, sculpture from Puglia, because if people don't know, Puglia has so many images, so many representations, primarily in sculpture of Black Africans, which can be identified as such. I went to Troya, and so I saw the Troya Cathedral, and I saw some of those. I think it's going to be interesting. I'll put it at interesting to contextualize all this sculpture from this period because it feels like it was ubiquitous.
Yeah. And Puglia is incredibly interesting. And sometimes some of the work there, has faded in importance. Privileging Tuscany and what Nicola Pisano brings out of all this, and his works are potentially related to this head as well. His attendance to the Magi in the Duomo of Siena.
Hmm.
But I think Puglia itself is a place that needs full kind of historical contextualization for these kinds of images. No question about it.
Absolutely. In conversation with historians too, because I wonder if we can look at inventories, but that's probably a methodological question. So what's what's the manuscript to your right is the book in honor of Augustus. I just have this translation here, Liber ad honorem Augusti, and it's written by Pietro da Eboli. And what I'm showing you here is a really interesting, to me, page from that is showing Tancred of Lecce. So a little history. Um, we're not looking at the time of Frederick II here. We're looking at the rise, the contested rise of Henry VI, who's the predecessor, right? And so Tancred of Lecce is the hometown boy, as it were. So he's up, and I don't know if you can still, let me see if I can.
Yeah, no, we can see
Okay,
it. We can see it.
okay. So this is Tancred of Lecce, and it's him processing into the city, specifically, I think Palermo at this time. And one of the things that becomes a hallmark of Frederick II, and many actually kings and emperors after him, is having Black Africans in his retinue. We also know that he bought slaves from Africa and made sure that they were trained in the trumpet. So I'm really interested in this image, not only because Tancred is here, but also because we have, and I think you might have talked about this in your article, Paul, but what I believe to be, and the color here, the dark wash here, to signify Black trumpeters, or I have to talk to my musicologist. I might not be saying the right word for that instrument, but I'm going to call it a trumpet and then be corrected. Here, and also to some extent,
The drummers, yeah,
chairs right here and
yeah.
drummers as well. And another person, when I was looking at this, I can't remember Camilla's last name. She's a scholar in Italy. She was in thinking about this being representations of dancers. And there's a long legacy of this in Europe writ large, Black Africans being musicians, but also dancers. So I'm really interested in this image because of that.
Yeah.
One
Uh,
thing, go
yeah.
ahead.
No,
Yeah.
I just mentioned at this juncture that for those who are interested in scholarship on dancing and music as attributes of Africans in Italy, they might want to look at the work of the Italian scholar Gianfranco Salvatore, who teaches in Puglia at the University of Salento. And I don't know if Leah can drop in his edited volume, Il Chiaro e l'Oscuro, with a long essay by him about the quite lengthy history of Italian imagers of Black dancers and of Black musicians. This is a volume that came out not too long ago, and probably is not yet that well known in the US. So thought I'd mention it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
So I am not currently writing on the Sicilian Hohenstaufen stuff just now.
right.
So really for me, it's about close looking at this time. And one thing I should note here is that unlike Johannes that we have on the left, these figures to the right don't have any physiognomy that really announces them as Black Africans. So
Just the wash. Yeah, yeah,
just the wash. So there's
yeah.
going to be some questions and some work done on that. But I also want to think about these claims of legitimacy and the use of Black Africans and what kind of status that will have. You know, a question comes up when you're looking at these objects to the degree that you can tell these people's stories, right? And not necessarily subject them to a Western gaze. And I wonder about that in my own work, and I don't at this juncture of the project, I'm not very sure that I will ever be able to do that. But thinking about Black Africans as a sign of class and status and what that means is really, really important to me. I'm going to show, I don't know if we have time, but I wanted to show this too.
Oh yeah, great. Yeah.
Um,
It's such a wacky image, right?
It's crazy to see in person too. I saw
Yeah,
it
yeah.
in Bern.
This is in Bern, yeah, yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Uh,
Do you want to tell the story?
oh, I'll say a few words about it, but so this is a 15th century manuscript of an Austrian chronicle, um, which is talking about events from the late 1200s, roughly 30 years after Frederick II's death in 1250, when a pretender, a false Frederick, as he was known, traveled around the Northern European countryside um, with a retinue of African servants claiming to be the emperor. Oh dear. Claiming to be the emperor who had never died, right, but was still living. And the proof of his imperial status as Frederick II was the presence of these black men distributing treasure. That's what's coming out of the big bag there down below. Eventually, the pretender was arrested, and I don't know if he was put to death, but certainly his attempt to fool uh, 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 imperial audiences was put a stop to. But that you could pretend to be the emperor merely by having such figures in your retinue. And this is still current. This is still something that's understood by the manuscript painter in the later 1400s.
Yeah. I think one thing I'll note about this, if everyone could probably see this, but this figure has blondish red hair. And I believe Sarah Lipton, I'm looking for her book, Sarah Lipton's Dark Mirror, talks about, I believe, the representation of Jews as Black. And so I wonder about this giving out of money and this kind of collapsing of certain identities, right? So Black African, but always also Jewish at the same time that are coming to play in this image. And so we should probably say that race is a really malleable category at this time.
Yeah.
Um, if you're reading the work of Geraldine Hang, you probably already know that religion was most often the basis of um, race and how people identified and stratified people. And so I like it. It's challenging, but I really enjoy when there can be an intersection of somewhat, right? Because I think we have to talk about the intersectionality when we look at these images. Also, when I saw it, the people in Ban are shout out, they're great. I wondered about this Black area over here because I was like, is this intentional? What's happening? What is this wash doing? It is not a defacement, it is intentional. And that's just to say, these are some of the thoughts I think about when I go see something in person. I try to be attentive. I also am very interested in the wash here of this figure. There's a little bit more brown in him. Uh,
Definitely two complexions, two
yeah,
complexion levels indicated here. Yeah.
this is a really, I mean, the more I always tell my students this, the more you look at something, the richer it becomes because are these just, I mean, I believe these are just birds in the sky. Is he pointing to the birds in the sky? Why is he pointing to the sky? So many questions.
I don't know
But
the answer to that. Maybe have to go back to the Chronicle, but uh,
yeah,
yeah,
but it's a really,
it's a superb, I mean, a superbly strange image. It also is happening around the time, just to add another level here, when by around 1450, images of the Magi in Germany in particular have solidified around the idea that one of the three Magi is black.
hmm,
And by the late 1400s, we're getting to the point where this is so normative that we can actually find examples of earlier manuscript work and painting and sometimes sculpture, which are painted over. Uh, this
hmm,
one of the white magi is blackwashed because it's become such an article of faith iconographically. Um, and looking at these washes too, which are not really accompanied otherwise by, physiognomic details associated with Africans particularly. And very interesting to think about how easy it was to create an African figure, at least in certain kinds of simple works, even perhaps when originally one was not intended. But I think these figures are absolutely intentional, given the nature of the story.
Yeah. And I think as English has been the forerunner of studies on race, it has been really trying to uncouple visual understandings as the primary understanding of race. And so I wonder in art history, not how we challenge that, that's not a challenge question,
Mm,
but how do we delicately bring that back into the sphere, in
mm,
a meaningful way that images do a different kind of labor than, let's say, the narratives that are being read right now, um, in constructing race. I think
mm.
that's a really big question for me.
Yeah, I think that's a
Um,
major one. And I mean, on the one hand, in terms of uncovering representation, um, because of the rapidity with which one can look through, let's say, a photo archive, right?
mhm,
The identification of Black characters in the early periods is something that art historians can do relatively rapid compared to an historian trying to sift through notarial data, let's say, um, or often kind of endless chronicles looking for reference points. But there can also sometimes be something that's too rapid about the art historical work, right?
mm.
Um, uh, and doesn't always provide full context before one can come to understand what the meaning of a Black figure might be in a particular European time and place.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we're coming close to time, but I didn't know if because this is the Zeno um
Yeah.
images. So I didn't know if you want to say a quick word before we.
A very quick word. This is a part of a fresco in the Tower of San Zeno, part of a structure that was, among other things, a guest house for visitors, including the Holy Roman Emperor in Verona. It's a work from the 1230s. Figure at the left is usually identified as Frederick II himself, clearly a kind of imperial figure. There are a total of 29 men lined up to pledge their fealty to him, it would appear, with a very notable group of four figures. And this is an example of work that was never in the Image of the Black in Western Art Archive. Um, it emerged really only in the 1990s after conservation work was done here that made the figures much more visible. And we're still, trying to figure out exactly the context here, the meaning of dress, not only for the Black figures, but all the figures around. I don't think we'll fully understand this until we have a global picture of all the kinds of ethnicity that are represented here. So this is another work that has come into public view, but that still needs plenty of further interpretation and contextualization.
Paul, can I tell you I tried to go see this in Verona and the tower is under construction.
Under construction, that's a bummer.
I
Yeah.
hate to interrupt. We have a couple really good questions, and actually that segue very nicely from what you just had up on the screen. So we have a question from Teresa Gross Diaz, who's a medievalist here in Chicago at Loyola. So fascinating. My question is regarding the purpose of Henry VI and Frederick II in making a point of having Blacks in their retinues. What exactly would that point have been? Is it about the expanse of their empire, their wealth? I doubt whether they thought in modern terms of inclusiveness, but could that idea have been somewhere in there?
I I do think it's about from and let me just say that again, this is images that I've taken but haven't fully digested in my own work, but I do think it's about the extent of empire, Also, Frederick II is really interested in maintaining his Muslim connections in a way. And so perhaps this plays into certain practices that were happening, let's say maybe in Egypt at the time. So I do I do think it's about status, and I do think it's about um a kind of dominance as well, a kind of representing the amount of reach and control you have.
I think at this point in European art, in the early 1200s, one of the few clear-cut the ethnic groups that artists are able to master, that they've established some conventions for and can convey clearly, are Black Africans. And so they often stand in for a much wider group of people. In the San Zeno frescoes, there are a lot of other people. None of the other complexions differ in any meaningful way, although there are a few physiognomic differences, bigger and smaller noses, things like that. So I do think it is inclusivity makes it sound too generous, but kind of universal dominance, to pick up on Denver's claim, I think is really important here. I think it meant one thing at the time of Henry VI, right? One thing that's changed by the time we get to Frederick II in 1220s, 1230s is his crusade, his sort of renting of Jerusalem from Muslim powers, and the presence that we're now beginning to learn more about, thanks to scholars doing work on Ethiopian history, which is a burgeoning field, I think, right now, medieval and early modern Ethiopian history. But the presence of Ethiopian monks in Jerusalem. And so it's not only about sort of reaching out to the Islamic world, but there's also some evidence it might be trying to show awareness of Christianity in Black Africa, which is available to crusaders who encounter Ethiopian monks in Jerusalem by this time. So that's one other possibility here.
Thanks for that rich response. We have a good question from Sinclair Bell, which will allow you to talk about your future work. And so I'd actually like you to expand on this. Given the central status of the image of the Black and Western art series to the field of art history, I was wondering what would both want to see added to a possible third edition of the series, if one was ever to be issued someday in the future. For instance, a digital version that could be continuously updated and that could take stock of an even wider corpus of images. This sounds great. So answer this, but also tell us a little bit about what you're working on at the moment too, if you don't mind.
I'll start. I'll try to be brief. Sinclair, glad you're here. And for those who don't know, this is a scholar working very actively and innovatively on ancient images of peoples from south of Sahara. Well, the series isn't quite done yet, is one comment I can make. I know David Beinman is working on the image of the Black and Caribbean art, for example, even as we speak, but it's almost done. I'll tell you very prosaically what I want. I want these volumes to have a decent index. And I have told this to all and sundry, Harvard University Press, my general editor, David Beinman, and others. They were splendidly produced books, and they cut corners in making the index. And so it makes them much more difficult than they need to be as reference works, which is, what they are really, finding something, seeing if something is actually in the volumes. And yes, digitally, Harvard University Press has stayed away from this. I guess it's the cost of photo reproduction, but Skip Gates can raise money for anything. I believe that if he set his mind to it, he could overcome that hurdle, but I think it would be hugely more useful. But what about you, Denva?
Sinclair, I really love that idea of an online edition that can be continuously updated, because then it becomes a real reference, right? Then it becomes a digital humanities project that has legs that could, enable further research. I think I would love that. So someone make that happen. The second thing is I would like for us to, when we talk about the Middle Ages, go to different continents, and that is not just European. That's probably the biggest thing that I would like to see included because we might begin to see valences. We might be able to see similarities. There might be some breakthroughs, really, through such connections. So, yeah, that's what I would like.
If it were digital, my index complaint would be less compelling because then it would be searchable in a real way, which it is unfortunately not right now. Yeah,
Do you both mind talking a little bit about what you're working on now?
yeah, Denver, you go first.
So I'm very much so at the beginning of a book project on representations of Black Africans, specifically in Italy. I am currently writing an article on that Giotto fresco. So that's and Paul, you're gonna get a huge shout out because I'm starting with looking at well, not the article, but really thinking about the possibility that Giotto probably saw the martyrdom of Mark and San Marco. And so
Oh,
starting with that and
oh
then
boy,
leading to
great
Giotto.
idea. Great idea.
So yeah, and that's, if anyone doesn't know, Paul suggests this in his introduction, and I've been looking at it really closely, and it's beautiful fodder for this.
That's terrific. I think that's a great way to go. Um, I as I get older, I work all over the place. I'm tend to be working right now a little bit more on post 1500 material. Um, Titian's and black images of black servants at the Medici court are sort of articles I have in the pipeline. Um, I want to, if we can go back to that initial slide, I want to wave a flag for a recent publication.
Yes.
Um, or I can hold it up myself, I suppose, here, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's fine. You don't need to go back. Um, in February, with a co-author and many other smaller contributors, I published a guidebook essentially to Black Venice throughout the centuries called African Venice, a guide to art, culture, and people. And it really is a guidebook. There are 10 walking tours of Venice to take you to places of historical note as far as people of color in Venice over the centuries, but also many, many indications of representations of Africans from before 1200, the kind of thing Denver was just mentioning, to the 19th and even 20th centuries. It's intended for a kind of broad audience, partly scholarly, but partly non-scholarly. There's an Italian edition as well. And I saw, I don't know if she's still on, Eleanor Goodman on the call. Penn State has agreed to release this guidebook early next year in the US. So it's not yet available except really in Italy, but it will be very soon. There's a lot of medieval material in it, stuff especially about the mosaics of San Marco, which there's an unusually large number of images of Africans there in a dizzying multiplicity of roles. So I think that's the thing I would most like to highlight.
Great. And yeah, shout out to Ellie Goodman for supporting all of our work.
Yeah.
So
Oh, that's right. Yes, yes.
yeah.
Leah has good reason to do so as well.
We're all grateful.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. I think we can get them all. They're interesting, useful questions here. An anonymous scholar has asked, and I know this is a big question, something I've thought about a little bit. Have you considered depictions of Black figures in terms of humoral theory? I might just mention that in our recent Seeing Race book, we have a good article by Ricardo Padron, who speculates about humoral theory in relationship to maps, and a lot of work has been done in terms of cartography and representations of people. But have you seen this engagement in art history?
I mean,
I would say not a lot yet. I mean, I think it's an excellent idea. You know, one other thing you could drop in the chat might be Heather Madar's book on sort of diversity in Albrecht Dürer's work. I think, which is right at the edge of our period, but he slips in, right? I think for Dürer in particular, the idea that his own humoral identification as a melancholic might have something to do with his attraction to Black subjects, which is quite notable in his work. And again, there's an immense variety of different characterizations of Africans there. Some rather vicious, but others, very admiring, let's say, including the presence of a Black figure in his coat of arms. I think that whole area could be opened up sort of via a fuller exploration of Dürer, and there's certainly some of that in the Madar book. So that's one place I see it. Another area that's sometimes been explored that's not exactly humoral, but it has to do with astrological color and complexion. And there is a history both in the Image of the Black and Western Art volumes, but in certain other studies of looking at that, because Blackness and whiteness in alchemy and astrology have various kinds of meanings, right? That are not strictly humoral in terms of the four, but are related to it. Denva, have you encountered any of this?
Not yet. I would say, Greek and Roman ethnographies really play a really crucial role in defining Blackness as well. It will continue to. So thinking about you being in a hot climate makes you far more prone to X, Y, and Z. So I've been looking into that, but not humoral. But I'll note that.
Yeah. I mean, you see it in history of science things. Peter Biller, who's written
Oh, yes.
about it, he certainly talks about this issue in some detail, but he tends not to link it up to visual representation. So I think there's definitely more work to be done in that direction.
Okay, thanks. We have a good question here from Tom Dale. Regarding the San Zeno fresco, I'm also wondering about the intersection with both the Roman imperial ideal of a multi-ethnic empire and what Roland Betancourt has described in relation to cosmopolitanism of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire.
Yeah, and as the questioner knows well from as evidenced by his excellent article, which you could also drop into the chat, maybe. I think. Did I send it? No, I didn't send it to you. Oh well. But very recent and very detailed piece. In Venice, these kinds of things tend to converge a little bit, right? That the tradition of Byzantine emphases on multi-ethnic empire, articulated in Venice, for example, in the Black figures in the Pentecost dome, the mosaic, come, close to the North Italian mainland, to a place like Verona, where this sort of thing is being articulated, and maybe, to keep up with the Byzantines, right? To keep asserting the claim that the empire in the West has the same kind of authority as that claim by the empire in the East. Yeah, I think that's a fruitful line of thought. Absolutely. And North Italy is where we can see those pieces coming together in particular.
So we could end with this forward-looking question by Ronique Gillis here. Out of curiosity, have either of you come across Black contemporary artists using representations from this period as references in their own art practices? And also adds many things for your conversation. I think this is something you both probably have thought about as well, where you're encountering contemporary artists engaging with.
As some of you may know, I've worked a little bit with the artist Fred Wilson, whose installation at the 2003 Biennale was particularly informed by this kind of imagery, not just up to 1500, but throughout Venice, Venice's longer history. But yeah, the medieval images, so far, I would say I have tended to see, and I wonder if Denva can supply some other examples, but I've tended to see contemporary artists of color gravitating more toward works that were produced after the explosion of the Atlantic slave trade in terms of European artworks. So if you think about Titus Kaphar or something, we're talking about 17th or sometimes 19th century imagery. The earlier material, Fred is one of the ones who has particularly addressed it. Denva, can you cite some other?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm thinking about like a Roland Betancourt has just been talking about, and I'm so sorry the name of the artist. He's a major artist that has eluded me right now. But the Byzantine period, right? So showing several Black people as saints or in the personage of saints with these very Gothic looking or Byzantine looking gold backgrounds, right? So I think people are encountering it to the degree that I see it directly engage with the images I'm looking at, probably not, or I have not yet seen it.
Yeah, I don't know, for example, of Johannes Maurus being picked up and riffed on. But I just talk for a second about audiences. Sometimes art historians only speak to themselves or other people in historical disciplines. But one of the things I'm hoping for with the guidebook is to speak more directly to a broader audience, including working artists. And I can say that we did have one success in this way, but it's not quite what the questioner was looking for. There was a West African artist who was in residence at a program in Venice, who created a painting this spring, which incorporated an image of the cover of the guidebook. So I think that's a start. Now I want that artist to jump in to the material and to grab something a little visually more interesting or more significant in terms of the medieval period. But I think as we try to expand our audiences for this material, I think we're likely to see more contemporary artists taking a stake in it. And I just should add, the Getty's work, including their volume Balthazar, which came out about a year ago or so, is also addressing itself to that broader audience. And I think we will see the results of it. And they do have a number of works of art illustrated in there and passages. I mean, contemporary art is referenced in that volume about the kind of long history of the Black Magus. And I think we'll see more going back in that direction as time goes on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This was a great way to end. And thank you for this beautiful conversation, such an important contribution to art history and medieval Renaissance studies. Really grateful to learn from you too. And I just put in the chat for any other questions, please feel free to email us at renaissance@newbury.org. And I will pass on questions we didn't get to Denva and Paul, and they can even email you if necessary. I'm just going to pull back my screen if I can. Hold on. Because I want to tell you all what's coming up next in our series. And hopefully this is working. You're seeing this. And just to remind you that this will be posted online as a recording on our YouTube channel, and you can watch all of our past recordings there. I think we have about a dozen already, which we're very proud of. And then next up, we have a conversation with Brandy Adams and Trudy Jikstra from Trudy from Amsterdam, Brandy from ASU, and they'll be talking specifically about race and early modern book history. So it's a nice segue from this conversation right here. And just want to thank Denva and Paul again for this beautiful conversation. And thanks to everybody for attending.
Thank you.